I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today I had someone write in asking why Nicaragua doesn't, or maybe suggesting that they should, reciprocate with the United States in blocking the majority of people from getting visas to be able to enter their country. And that absolutely makes a lot of sense. It's a super logical thing to wonder about, especially in this day and age when both the UK and the EU are going to be starting reciprocation with the United States, meaning they're going to be blocking American citizens from just being able to go directly into the United Kingdom or the European Union, the Schengen zone, without needing to first get a visa. Now, that process between those regions is very simple and straightforward. Nearly everyone is able to do it, but traditionally, the ability for Nicaraguans to move to the United States, move to meaning visit, to travel, or to find work, is very difficult, yet it's not the same coming the other direction. So the question posed is, why doesn't Nicaragua, or maybe should Nicaragua, look at reciprocating with the United States? So we're going to dig into that and the factors that would entail whether that makes sense or not right after the bump. Before we dig in too much about reciprocation, one of the things that was mentioned in this question, and I will pop it up on the screen so that you can see it there, is that one of the reasons that a country like Nicaragua may want to limit the mobility or the availability of Americans to come into their country is that Americans abroad, and of course this is a more general thing, but in this specific case, Americans abroad are capable of acting as spies or agents for their home country. And of course we hear the same thing in America all the time, that maybe Americans need to be wary of Chinese coming into the country because they may be agents of the Chinese government. So this is worth mentioning, I think. I think there's one discussion about this reciprocation, and that's an economic one, and then there's this security discussion. And I think that this is misleading or comes from a place where the United States has in need, right, spread this disinformation that Chinese nationals or just people of Chinese descent being in the United States may represent a risk that they are willing to act as agents for their home government. Now, of course, there are Chinese citizens who are certainly willing to act as agents for their own government, just as there are Americans willing to act as agents for the American government, and you can find people from any country willing to act as agents for their own government. That's always going to be the case. That is true. However, this overlooks, one, the number of people willing to do that or capable of doing that, right? You need an overlap in the Venn diagram of people who are able to be foreign agents and people who are desirous of being foreign agents, and only that overlap group is potentially going to go do that if the government of whatever country so wants them to do that, but it completely overlooks the ease at which those countries could go and get agents who aren't from their own country and would be far less suspicious. Let's face it, if I was the United States and I wanted to send secret agents somewhere, someone who really stands out as American is about the worst person you could send. Now, the U.S. has the advantage that what is an American is a very hard thing to define, and it is a little bit harder to just spot one on the street than people coming from heavily homogenous countries or regions, or it's a little bit easier to potentially identify someone. However, there are, for example, loads of Americans and Europeans who live in China. Most of them fall into no more or less of a category of being potentially incentivized by China to go be agents somewhere else. So if China wanted to send an agent to the U.S., they're much more likely to send someone who would pass as American from a what Americans think Americans look like perspective, someone who's not going to draw attention, someone who may have grown up in the United States, someone who has an American accent and so forth. They have plenty of Americans who would be willing to work as agents for a foreign government, maybe because they're ideologically connected with that foreign government, or maybe just because they want a paycheck. There's plenty of people who would like to be able to work remotely, and that gives them that option, right? So what an interesting job someone could have, right? So it's really not hard for a major country to hire agents in any other country if that's something that they so choose to do. They absolutely do not benefit from sending their own citizens, or at least not the majority of their own citizens. The same thing here in a very specific case. If America wants to send agents to Nicaragua, of course, they do have plenty of Americans, and you see it on the comments all the time, people who jump in and are perfectly willing to spread disinformation on behalf of the U.S. So we know those people who are willing are out there. We also know a lot of them are bots, so let's not mix the point. But we also know that the United States has very deep pockets basically an unlimited budget for sowing dissent and causing problems abroad, which would include potentially spying efforts, as people had mentioned. If the United States wanted to have spies in Nicaragua, they would simply hire Nicaraguans to do so. They would have absolutely no challenge in doing that, and I think it goes without saying that this is something that the U.S. does all the time. They certainly don't need to send obvious Americans who would stand out like a sore thumb and easily be identifiable in any given situation to do that for them. That would actually be counterproductive from a how useful they would be perspective, and also be unbelievably expensive when it's unnecessary to do so. The salary and the cost of moving someone out of their home country to go do that kind of thing is extremely high. The cost of hiring someone in that country to do it, very, very low. So that's just the basic economics of that. So that is not something that Nicaragua is considering seriously. They certainly have considerations, just like any country does, that people coming into their country might be acting badly as agents of a foreign country. Of course they consider that, but they have to consider that that is true across every single country that's coming in, and they have to look at the security of all people broadly, the same as every country does, right? It's not unique. This is something countries do to keep themselves safe as best that they can. So that's already happening. That's already being considered, and obviously they don't want to shut their borders based on that. They would give up basically every possible tourist, every possible investor, and the same thing, the United States doesn't want to do that. The United States is willing to do that much more so because they have more investment, they have more internal market to work with, they just have fewer needs of interacting with the outside world, whereas Nicaragua is quite small and needs a lot of external interactions to be able to do what it needs to do. It can't just turn in on internal markets, it just isn't big enough. So the United States is able to be a bit more xenophobic, a little bit more paranoid in that way, but the basics are still the same. Both countries want to maintain as many people coming and going as they can while identifying bad or potentially bad actors as best as they can. But trying to eliminate entire countries because in theory those people might work for the government. Well, in the United States, people talk about how every company in China somehow has to answer to the Chinese military or something. Well, that sounds totally paranoid and crazy. You're basically eliminating the entire world when you say those things. And who has to answer more to a government than American companies? We know that American technology companies are constantly having to answer and adjust their products for the industrial military complex in the United States. We know that companies like Cisco, even if they're not voluntarily doing it, their supply chain is compromised and the U.S. government is putting things to spy on other countries and their own citizens into those products before they move. These are not conspiracies. These are well-known supply chain problems for things passing through the U.S. So we already know that these things exist in every market. The idea that every company, just because they're every citizen, either one, just because they're from a country represents a specific threat doesn't make any sense. That is a pure FUD out of the American propaganda machine, and Nicaragua is not going to fall for that. Most countries are not going to fall for that, but American citizens are often going to repeat it. And so if you're hearing a lot of things from the U.S., you're seeing a lot of U.S. media, it's easy to think that maybe this is a realistic threat, but it is not. Of course, you have to be careful with people from any country. There are threats out there, but the what country they're from threat is relatively disconnected. All right, let's talk about reciprocation with foreign travel. Now, this one sounds pretty obvious. Now, if you're a Nicaraguan and you want to travel to the United States, you want to go for work, extremely hard. You want to go as a tourist, nearly as hard. You want to just travel through. You just want to be able to use a U.S. airport. You're heading to Canada or you're heading to Europe, but your flight's going to stop in Miami briefly. Really, really hard to get a visa to allow you to do that. Nicaraguans are essentially embargoed on a personal basis from being able to operate within the region anywhere because the U.S. blocks their visa process. And other countries, from time to time, will use the American visa as a proxy so they don't have to pay for their own visa program. They say, if the U.S. gives you a visa, you can come here, no problem. But if they don't, we don't have a process for you, right? Especially because places like Nicaragua, very small, they can't have direct relations with every possible country out there. So this is one of the ways that other countries handle that. Nicaragua could easily do the same thing. Oh, Guatemala gave you a visa? Good, you can come here too, right? Which they do because of the CA4. But they could do that with other countries as well. They could say the same thing about Mexico as an example. And Mexico does this with the U.S., right? In many cases, if the U.S. has given you permission, Mexico will also give you permission. They'll simply write it on the existing visa. That makes sense. It's not a terrible process. But when you have a country like the United States who is heavily barring Nicaraguans from not just visiting the U.S., but from traveling throughout the region, from investing in the U.S., from being able to look for work broadly, being able to get to other countries that are open to them for where they could work, such as Spain and much of Europe, that becomes a major problem and functions like an embargo. It's a soft embargo, but it is an embargo nonetheless. But it's not an embargo against the country. It is an embargo against the people of Nicaragua. It is a very personal thing. It is a strong statement as to how much the United States wants to harm the Nicaraguan people. It is personal in every sense. If they were simply tariffing the country or whatever, those things are at least a gray area where it could be an action against the country, but that is not what is happening. This is a personal situation. Now, so the question becomes, because that is happening, because Nicaraguans struggle so hard to be able to go to the U.S., even for very useful purposes to both parties, because it's something like 1%, 2% of Nicaraguans who apply will ever be able to go as a normal person to the United States. Temporarily, the parole program gave a limited criminal-like behavior permission to temporarily reside in the United States, but that was very, very temporary, both in the residing that you were able to do and very temporary in being available. So there was this momentary thing that is essentially gone. It's not 100%. We expect it to be completely gone in the coming months, but at this point it has been crippled to the point of being essentially gone. But so there are some programs, and certainly some Nicaraguans get to go, and I know many Nicaraguans who've gone legally, personal friends of mine, but in many cases people go illegally to the United States because they're given no other option. It's the U.S. has made illegal immigration, or illegal expatting, as it actually is called, the only relevant path to the United States, making it in many ways legal, right? If it's the only thing that is offered to you, well, it becomes the way, right? And you can call it illegal, but that becomes semantics, right? You've created it as the appropriate path, so you can't actually call it illegal. There are just penalties, right? So the question becomes, why doesn't Nicaragua treat the United States the same way? An American citizen coming to Nicaragua does not need to get a visa at all, and generally has absolutely no problem entering the country. And they don't just get to enter the country, but they get to enter for 180 days under normal circumstances. They get to renew without any overhead, and getting permanent residency is super easy, and they're allowed to do all kinds of really great things in the country, like working from the country, when they do like work from home, work abroad, digital nomad, that kind of stuff. You are not allowed to come here and work under normal circumstances. So it's not 100% that you can just do anything, right? The same thing, you can't easily as a Nicaraguan go to the United States and work. You cannot easily as an American come to Nicaragua and work. However, not very many people are seeking to do that. So Nicaragua is not particularly locking anything down in that case, but a little bit. We certainly see a lot of people here on the channel who at least talk about the potential of wanting to do that. I don't know any who follow through or would want to once they've researched, but plenty of people bring up the idea. So it's on the table at least. And that is something that unless you become a major investor or put in the incredible amount of time to become an actual citizen, that is not going to be available to you under normal circumstances. But the ability to work remotely from Nicaragua while living here, the ability to invest here, to buy a house here, to own a business here, all those things completely and utterly open to Americans and Canadians and others, as much as open can be. So why don't they reciprocate? Why don't they lock down and punish Americans the way that Americans are punishing Nicaraguans? Well, that's a great question, and you can see why you may, especially from an emotional perspective, when the U.S. locking people out of their market is such a personal one, that many Nicaraguans may feel, rightfully so, that perhaps they should reciprocate and punish America for that. I totally understand, and emotionally, that is definitely the place that nearly everyone would go to. However, in both cases, we have countries that are trying to do what's best for them and their people, and we can agree or not agree with them, but let's look at these dynamics. The United States heavily wants to, under normal circumstances, keep people from, especially Nicaragua, but much of the region, out of the United States. They have a lot of propaganda that comes out. They have a lot of media and marketing that comes from the region, and they don't want people coming into the United States unless they're under very controlled circumstances. And I don't mean legal immigration. I mean they want people coming in that the government has a really tight control of, that they have some oversight as how they're likely to vote, that they are going to not be an economic problem in the country, that they're not going to be a criminal element that the government can't oversee, that they don't have some way to manipulate. And that they are going to not become a foreign actor in their country, and a bunch of things, right? The U.S. quite often wants and prefers, this is why it is, for anyone who's wondering, why does the U.S. make it so easy for illegal immigrants to get in and so hard to become a legal immigrant? And all those terms are wrong. Immigrant is not the right term. Expat is the term for what's actually happening most of the time. Legal and illegal are really fungible terms here. They are not very accurate as to what's actually happening. So why is what we call illegal actually treated so badly and legal treated so, thought of so badly, but given the ability to move in, and legal paths basically don't exist? Well, the simple answer is because they're trying to incentivize illegal immigration, or what they call that, right? The act of sneaking in expatting, because that group often ends up paying taxes, is often able to be manipulated and controlled easily by a government that they are afraid of. They are subject to their neighbors. They're unlikely to go out and actually start good businesses and ship lots of money abroad, but they are often easily put into situations where they can be what becomes essentially slave labor. They basically get human trafficked in. They are outside the system. They are hard to monitor, which is convenient for a government that wants to encourage them to work below minimum wage and to do dangerous or unsought after jobs that Americans don't want to do. Americans, and especially American politicians, love to rail against the concept of what they call illegal immigration, but this very heavily promoted expatting workforce is actually incredibly beneficial to America, the American economy, and the American people, and they depend heavily upon it. So they've designed a system to create exactly the kind of behavior that they actually want to have. Obviously, this should have to go without saying. No one should have to explain that the government has organized the rules so that they get the behavior they want. That is what the rules are for. Same thing when we talk about tax structure. The government structures taxes to encourage behaviors that they want to have happen. It's not by accident. There's no tax code. There's no immigration codes happening because it just happened. No, this is careful planning in every case. This is a major government with a lot of resources. This is not haphazard. This is some of the most prominent and important stuff happening in any given country. Now, unless the United States is going to be gaining an economic benefit or some other major benefit from immigrants, they actually want to discourage it quite a bit, because the United States depends so heavily on propaganda and a media image being projected around the world. The United States actually has quite a bit of risk. Now, if you're talking about Canadians or Western Europeans, generally they have a very good idea of what the United States is actually like, and the kinds of things that they're shocked about might be things like how much Americans look each other in the eye or nod to each other on the street, or that we actually eat certain types of food at different times of year that people don't believe, or that we eat as much fast food as we do. Simple little tuning things, but they aren't actually surprised by major points of culture in the United States, or that the propaganda coming out of the U.S. is actually heavily propaganda, right? They're totally used to that and they expect that. But coming from places like Central America especially, the United States depends very heavily on projecting an image that is dramatically different than it actually is, in many ways just to promote that illegal immigration, as they like to call it, into the United States, giving false hope that it is the land of milk and honey, that people will be given free healthcare and free jobs and be super rich and own 3 cars and be taken care of as soon as they cross the border with no worries and everything is super safe. And then they get there and realize that it's very hard to find a job. If they do find a job, likely they will be paid below minimum wage. They'll have to live in squalor because they cannot find a place to live. They don't have credit ratings. They have a million things to deal with, and then they find out it is super dangerous. I have personal friends who have had their friends shot in the street because someone thought it was funny to put them in the line of fire with gangs because they knew nothing of the violence in the United States and their employer did not respect them as a person. These are real risks. And then finding out that there's no affordable healthcare, and what healthcare you get is not up to the standards that they were used to in their home country. All these things depend on propaganda to make them think that that is not the case. And so they need that people don't find out in large groups. Of course, a few people finding out simply won't be believed. But once you have large numbers of people realizing that the facade of the United States is just that, and that a lot of the things they talk about aren't very important. GDP does not reflect the wealth of the individual person, for example. Anyone who's living, 78% of the United States is living paycheck to paycheck, but the United States depends on people in Central America believing that those people are somehow rich while still living paycheck to paycheck. That's not logical, but with enough media and enough propaganda, people just don't believe logic or reality, and they don't want to, so they have the advantage that there's this desire, this hoping that you'll be able to win the lottery ticket by sneaking into the United States, so that hope often overrides logic. Now, in the opposite direction, Nicaragua does not have those same factors. One, they do not need workers from the United States. They're not encouraging an illegal movement or an undocumented movement, anything like that. They want documented people coming in through official channels and being above board and so forth, because they want to keep them in the system. They want people to get in and potentially pay taxes. They do not want people working below minimum wage. They're not completely, utterly opposed to it, but it's a totally impractical situation that will never actually work. So if you did have an American sneak in and work for $20 a month doing something. They'd not be legal, but that's really not that disastrous because no one here is going to work at $20 a month. So, okay, if that's what you're really going to do. But in general, Nicaragua has completely opposite factors, but the biggest one, the one that matters absolute most, well, there's two that are really, really significant. One is that legal expats, those that lean towards the affluent, represent a very large source of foreign income for Nicaragua. So they want to have as many as they can get that are behaving well and not impacting the culture. There's a balance, of course, but within that scope, they want to get as many as they can because it's an important part of the economy. Whereas in the United States, the actual remittances or the expat spending are incredibly minor parts of the economy for lots of reasons, that it's just different economies overall. So because of that, Nicaragua has a very strong financial incentive to bring people in a legal, documented way. They also have an absolute, and this is something that has been mandated as an executive order, that they are to promote the visibility and dissemination of information about the country. It's one of the reasons that it's so nice making this show here in Nicaragua, because I'm actually in what would easily be classified as a protected class, because I use cameras and I show the country and I actually go around and document things. And there are actually rules protecting doing this in Nicaragua. Not just the normal rules, but very specific rules that are like, you can't interfere with people telling people about Nicaragua because there's so little information coming out about the country from reality, right? And there's so many propaganda sources and media outlets specifically in North America, but other places controlled by North America or influenced by North America, who are spreading disinformation, that it is critical for countries like Nicaragua to have foreigners, Americans especially, to come to their country, because every American that comes here leaves. Not everyone wants to move here. Not everyone says this is the place they want to stay. Some people just can't handle the heat, all kinds of things. But one thing that's universal is they come away with a knowledge that Nicaragua is not the place that they've been being told about by their own country, and very importantly, the knowledge that their home country has been lying to them. It's a very powerful bit of information, and that's, you can see very quickly, Nicaragua is doing everything it can to have as many Americans and Canadians and Europeans find out the truth. They want you to see firsthand and are willing to bend over backwards to make that easy, while America is specifically avoiding people getting firsthand knowledge. America depends on a facade. America depends on the majority of people around the world believing a projected image. Nicaragua depends heavily on getting as many people as possible to see the actual reality for themselves, so that there's at least some voice out there speaking up for them, some segment of the population saying, whoa, 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 I saw this. This is not what was going on. I saw them report this on the news, and then I went and looked and it wasn't happening. I heard that this was what it was like, and then I went and looked and it wasn't what it was like. And it doesn't just expose that this is happening in Nicaragua. It tells Americans especially, but everyone, that the information they're getting around all of the world is suspect. If we can't trust what our news outlets are telling us about this country, why would we trust it about another country that we equally don't have a reference to verify? We have to then question those things. That's really, really important. So above all things, yes, there's an economic factor. The United States heavily wants immigrants that come in through an undocumented expat process. That's the most beneficial thing to the U.S. in most cases. And Nicaragua heavily wants any expats to come in through a legal documented process. And the United States really wants them to be expats and to leave. And Nicaragua really wants them to become immigrants and stay, right? And that's kind of the difference, right? So the United States likes to call them immigrants because for some reason that is a negative connotation. Shouldn't be. Immigrants are what built America. Every one of us are immigrants to the United States. Personally, my family were immigrants to the, I believe, Mohicans. I actually need to check, but we were actually into an Indian nation before we became immigrants into the United States. I'm obviously European, but my family actually joined an Indian nation prior to coming to the British colonies. And so we're all immigrants of one sort or another, or layers of immigrants, right? Now, my American immigration post that was by being conquered. So I was indigenous in that way. Like, that's a weird thing, but if I was there before the colony and then you're conquered by the colony along with the Indians, what is that, right? So that makes for a funny juxtaposition that you have to then figure out what that represents. But we're all immigrants, right? The United States is built on immigration. It has to be because of the population that it has. To then somehow have immigration have a negative connotation is absurd within their context, and yet somehow they've managed to make that seem to be the case. But this is also important. We say this a lot. In Spanish, expat is a negative word, even though it feels positive in English. It's neutral in English, but it often feels very positive. But in Spanish, it's a very negative word. Migración, or immigration, in Spanish is positive or neutral, but expat is quite negative. And you do have to be careful because Google will translate expat from the English sense into expat in the Spanish language directly, and it is a complete mistranslation, changes what you are saying utterly in every sense. So be very careful using that in that way. But that is why, right? We have these polar opposite desires. The United States wants undocumented expats. Nicaragua wants documented immigrants. The United States wants a facade and to hide as best they can what reality is. And Nicaragua wants to expose reality firsthand. One benefits from hiding and one benefits from being exposed. So that is why Nicaragua is not going to consider, I guarantee, reciprocation with the United States. It will be playing into their hands. If Nicaragua hides Nicaragua from the world loses a critical bit of information about itself and specifically about Nicaragua. But if the United States does not let the world in, they benefit from people not finding out reality because they've managed to project an image that is so overly positive that people have a hard time accepting reality and will deny it to the bitter end. Both people who live in the United States and those who have never been there, who simply refuse to have any knowledge of the country that is not projected by Hollywood or major news outlets. That's a big, long-winded explanation as to something that I think a lot of people actually wonder about, and I know emotionally it feels like, boy, reciprocating would feel good, but it would not be the best response. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. You can join our channel. We have a membership group and a super secret chat room that you can get into with that, but a lot of people can't figure out how to get in. We're working on that. And as always, I will see all of you tomorrow.